Hi everyone. The other day, I was reading about the latest MoU signed between the United States and Iran. At the outset, and I'm sure the media is already talking about it, an MoU to begin with is willingness to engage in a conversation and not an agreement. Iran was indeed engaging in a conversation prior to the 28th Feb attacks, and these were actually getting to a conclusion as was confirmed by Oman. The MoU is nothing but a reset to situation prior to 28th of Feb 2026. Well, indeed, a reason to celebrate. Now, this MoU also reminded me of an argument I once had with my sister. Now, before you jump and start to accuse me of turning Middle East geopolitics into a family drama, it's the touch and feel management consultant within me and engineer within me which actually prompted me to assess this geopolitical event from a lens of a family relation. So please have a little patience, and I assure you that by end of this story, you might conclude that family drama and geopolitics are operating from the same instruction manual. A few years ago, my sister and I had an argument. Now, let's call myself as America and let's call my sister as Iran. And believe me there is a third character in this argument which I will unfold at the right time. Not because either of us wanted to be those countries, but because both of us were stubborn enough to qualify as ones. Well, our argument actually started over something very trivial, just as most disasters do. Nobody starts a war saying, hey, this seems like a fantastic idea, let's go to war. And nobody starts a family argument thinking, hey, this should be comfortable to consume my entire afternoon. Yet somehow, both things happen. 1 hour later, my sister and I were no longer discussing the issue. We were actually discussing the principles. 2 hours later, we were discussing history. And 3 hours later, we were discussing each other's character flaws. Which, if you think about it, in today's US Iran conflict is pretty much the standard escalation ladder in international relations. At some point, I realized something. I'm no longer wanting to solve the problem. I just wanted to win. And judging by the look on my sister's face, she had reached exactly the same conclusion. Now, if I'm America and she's Iran, you can already see where this is heading. Eventually, we stopped talking. Not because we agreed, not because we've solved anything, not because one side surrendered. We simply stopped talking because we were exhausted. And the house, it entered a state called strategic silence. Diplomats, they call it de-escalation. And families, they call it sulking. Same thing, no shouting, no accusations, no escalation. Just two stubborn parties sitting in separate rooms convinced they are morally more superior. Again, America, Iran, and you get the picture. A few hours later, I walked into the kitchen. My sister, she was making tea. Without looking at me, she said, do you want one? And ladies and gentlemen, what she offered wasn't tea. What she offered was diplomacy. What she offered was an MoU. And that was months of subtle diplomacy condensed into a teacup. And I said, sure. And she handed me the cup. And I said, thanks. She said, you are welcome. And just like that, the ceasefire began. The oil prices dropped. The Strait of Hormuz reopened. Markets celebrated. CNN prepared a special report. Everything was wonderful for approximately 14 hours. And that, my friends, is an MoU. Because the next morning, her best friend, she called. And now we need to talk about the most important person in this story. And the most important person, ladies and gentlemen, is my sister's best friend. Let's call her best friend as Israel. Because just like the real Israel, she wasn't particularly interested in whether the argument had stopped. All she wanted to know whether the reason for the argument had disappeared. Big difference. While my sister and I were celebrating the tea, her friend was actually conducting an audit. She asked one question, just one. So what exactly did you guys agree to? And behold, I nearly choked on my breakfast because suddenly I realized something. I had no answer. She had no answer. And actually, what did I agree to and what did she agree to? Nothing. What had changed? Nothing. What had been solved? Nothing. The tea was real. The peace was real. The problem was also real. And that's exactly why Israel's position today is so fascinating. America, it's looking at the tea. Iran is looking at the tea. The markets are looking at the tea. It's Israel which is looking under the table to see whether the original problem is still sitting there and how it can exploit that problem that still sits there. Now let's be fair. Yes, tea matters. I am not anti-tea. In my family, tea has prevented several diplomatic incidents and sometimes the beer has. In geopolitics, the ceasefires matter. Stopping people from shooting each other is a good thing. That shouldn't even be actually controversial. And let's not confuse tea with transformation. If my sister and I were arguing about money, well, tea doesn't solve the money problem. Tea only changes or shifts the focus. Now, if we were arguing about the trust, the tea doesn't solve the trust problem either. If America and Iran disagree about nuclear capability, regional influence and security guarantees, guess what? Tea doesn't solve these either. Tea, it simply allows everybody to sit down long enough to keep discussing them. Now some people ask, why did this happen now? Simple. At some point, everybody looked at the bill. My sister, she looked at the emotional bill, and I looked at the emotional bill as well. And then America looked at the political bill. Iran, it looked at the economic bill. The markets, they looked at the financial bill. And everybody independently arrived at the same conclusion. This argument is becoming expensive. And when arguments become expensive, tea suddenly becomes attractive. MoU suddenly become attractive. Then there is the election angle. Let's be honest. If I am America approaching an election cycle, what sounds better? Conflict continues indefinitely or historic diplomatic breakthrough achieved? Exactly. The answer is so obvious that even my sister's best friend would agree, which doesn't make the agreement fake or the MoU fake. It simply makes it more human, more humane. Political incentives and diplomatic incentives occasionally decide to travel together. Whether they reach the goal or not is something that the world has to watch out for. Now here's where I think both the optimists and pessimists, they get carried away. The optimists, they see the tea and declare peace. The pessimists, they see the tea and they predict another war. My sister's best friend sees the tea and asks for details. Honestly, that's probably the most intelligent response because eventually every ceasefire reaches the same moment. The moment after the photographs, the moment after the handshake, the moment after the tea, the moment when somebody asks, fine, but what are we doing about the actual problem? And that's where the real work starts. Not before and not after. So when people ask me whether this US Iran MoU is a peace agreement, I think back to my kitchen. I think about the tea. I think about my sister. And most importantly, I think about her best friend because my sister and I achieved something important. We stopped making the situation worse. But we had not yet started making it better either. And that may be the most honest description of where America, Iran, and Israel find themselves today. And the niceties have been exchanged. The headlines have been written. And now comes the difficult conversation. And every brother knows what happens next. Every geopolitical pundit knows what happens next. The real test isn't when your sister accepts the tea. The real test is when her best friend asks, fine, but what actually changed? And right now, that's exactly the question Israel is asking. And it's exactly the question the rest of us should also be asking and looking out for. Thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.